Okay, continuing our study of that enigmatic book of Revelation. Today, we're going to endeavor to cover chapters 2 and 3, but who knows how far we'll get and where we'll go. Last week we had an introduction to what we're going to be studying this week, and what we're going to try to focus on today will be the letters, the messages that were given to the 7 churches. And there's a lot to be said about that. Before I get into that specifically, let me read the introduction that we had starting in chapter 1. This is in verse 9. I, John, your brother and fellow partaker in tribulation and kingdom and perseverance which are in Jesus, was on the island called Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. Now we know he was exiled there because of the word. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like the sound of a trumpet, saying, Write in a book what you see, and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, and to Smyrna, and to Pergamum, and to Thyatira, and to Sardis, and to Philadelphia, and to Laodicea. And I turned to see the voice that was speaking with me. And having turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and in the middle of the lampstands, one like a son of man, clothed in a robe reaching to the feet, and girded across his breast with a golden girdle. And his head and his hair were white like wool, like snow, and his eyes were like a flame of fire, and his feet were like burnished bronze, when it has been caused to glow in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of many waters. And in his right hand he held 7 stars, and out of his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in its strength. And when I saw him, I fell at his feet as a dead man. And he laid his right hand upon me, saying, Do not be afraid, I am the first and the last, and the living one. And I was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and of Hades. Write therefore the things which you have seen, and the things which are, and the things which shall take place after these things. And as for the mystery of the 7 stars which you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels or the messengers of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. So here we have the introduction to the 7 churches. And the 7 churches, as we discussed last time, are very significant. 7 churches are listed here. And what we know historically, that these 7 churches actually did exist at the time. And this letter was actually delivered to those churches. However, we also know, based upon the context of the writing, that the messages that were given to these 7 churches were not specifically and uniquely for those 7 churches. The message that we have here is a message that is for all times. And we also discussed last time, each one of these 7 churches, I think, represents particularly, each of these 7 churches had the characteristics of 7 historical churches that would exist down through the ages. We'll talk about that. But I think one of the most significant things we see here is that these 7 churches, I believe, represent the churches of all time. Now, what do I mean by that? I believe that every church that has ever existed and will ever exist can be described by reference to one of these 7 churches. And I think that's the reason why we have it. And what we have in these churches are, with respect to these churches, are messages that were delivered by Christ himself. And the messages were very specific. And if you spend any time this past week studying these, you saw some things that were similar as between the various messages that went to each one of these churches. And we're going to talk about those in particular. But on my chart here, I made something of a matrix, not a very neat one, but one that you might want to copy down at some point in time and fill in the blanks. I did this for my own benefit. You have each one of the 7 churches that are listed here, from Ephesus to Smyrna to Pergamum to Thyatira to Sardis to Philadelphia to Laodicea. 7 churches, and we know that the number 7 is significant. What does the number 7 connote? Perfection or completeness. And so that's why I say that when we have the messages and the descriptions of these 7 churches, the message is complete, the description is complete, and so I think it describes churches of all time. And of course, one of the things that we'll want to do as we finish our study here, is ask of ourselves, in what category does our church fall into which one of these 7 categories? And we're going to see that there seem to be at least 7 messages or characteristics that are given in each one of these sermons, if you will, or messages that's given each one of these churches. First, we have the listing of the church. Then, interestingly, we have a description of the sender. We know it's Jesus himself, the man who is described as the Son of Man in what I just read. But you'll see that there's a unique characteristic given for the sender of the message. And I think the characteristic that's given of the sender of the message helps us to understand what the message is about. We'll talk about that later. And then something else that's very interesting about each one of these messages that we'll see is it begins with a statement that I know. I know your deeds. As if to say, Jesus is saying to each one of these churches, I know what you've done. I know who you are. I know everything about you. And don't think that you can fool me, or don't think that you can hide anything. And then we also see in these messages that, with the exception of just a couple, there's a positive statement about the church. I think there is a positive statement about all of them. And then there's a negative statement about most of them. There's 2 of them, I think, that as to which there is no negative statement. We'll talk about those too. And then there is an interesting phrase that's used. It says, he who has an ear, let him hear. You know, interestingly, that phrase is used with respect to each one of the 7 churches. And so we have the reference to the ear, and some commands are given, and then some promises are given. And it's interesting, as you read this, it is said of these, to him who overcomes, I will do something. So as to each one of these 7, there's a reference to an overcoming. And so that's something that we'll discuss as we go through. So what it is that we're told must be overcome about each one of these 7 churches. Now, as we discussed last time in our introduction, perhaps a good way to start our study is to look at these 7 churches in the context of history. And various commentators have said that the 7 churches represent 7 different periods of the church. The church at Ephesus, or the first one, being the church of the apostolic period, beginning in roughly 100 AD. The second one, the church at Smyrna, is characteristic of the martyr church that existed roughly 300 to 500, the time of significant martyrdom within the Christian church. The third one, the church at Pergamum, is representative or characteristic of the state church that existed from roughly 300 AD to 500 AD. When I say the state church, that would have commenced at the time where Emperor Constantine of Rome legalized the Christian church and made it the state church. And then the church at Thyatira is representative of the papal church, and that would have been the time, the papal, P-A-P-A-L, that's when the Pope ascended to power. And particularly that is a time when the Pope ascended to power and exercised his power in a way that was not a positive influence on the church. And you know, I'm not making any general commentary about the papacy, but we all know there was a period of time in history when the papacy sank to very low, to a low ebb, and some very negative things happened in the name of the church. And then in chapter 3, the church at Sardis is representative of or characteristic of the Reformation church that existed around the same time, that is starting about 1500 AD. And the Reformation church is that which was begun, if you will, or initiated by Martin Luther, the Protestant Reformation in the early 1500s. The church at Philadelphia is said to be representative of the missionary church and the great mission efforts that began in the 1800s and have continued to the present day. And then finally, the church at Laodicea is representative of the apostate church. And what do we mean by that? The church that calls itself a church but has rejected the Christian principles. And I think we can all recognize that we are currently living in the time of the apostate church. Not to say that all churches are apostate, but there are a great many churches today bodies who claim to be churches but are utterly apostate. They have rejected the truth of the Scriptures, in other words. Okay, well let's go back then and let's start with this first message, and let's see if we can dissect this and find out exactly what it is that we were intended to learn by these messages. And I want to remind everybody about one of the principal reasons why we study the book of Revelation. And we'll go back to Revelation chapter 1, verse 3. If you don't have any other reason to study this enigmatic book, here it is. Quote, "Blessed is he who reads, and those who hear the words of the prophecy, and heed the things which are written in it, for the time is near." So, here we have a specific promise of a blessing that comes to us if what? If we read these words, if we hear these words, and if we heed the things that were written in it. All right, does that mean that word heed, does that mean that we have to understand everything that's written in the book of Revelation? Well, I hope not, because I certainly don't. I think all it means is that we are to endeavor to understand it, and to the extent that we do understand it, put it in practice. And so I think there are important things that we can glean and learn in each one of these messages to the churches. All right, who wants to start first? Let's start there down at that end. Warren, you want to read for us chapter 2? Why don't you read the entirety of the message to the church at Ephesus, would be chapter 2, verses 1 through 7.
Let's see. To the angel of the church at Ephesus, write.
Pause right there, and I'm going to stop you as you read through. To the angel, you remember in the introductory passages that I read, there was a vision of a lampstand and the stars, and the lampstand represents what? The churches. And the stars represent what? The angels. Now, that word angel that's used there, the actual word is messenger. Now, in the context of these letters that are written to each one of these churches, it says it's written to the angel of the church in Ephesus. What it really says is that it's written to the messenger in the church at Ephesus, which could more specifically refer to the pastor or the leader of that church rather than a supernatural angel who is there. And perhaps it makes more sense if we understand it in that context. In other words, that these letters are written to the messenger, that is, the pastor or the leader of each one of these churches. And the message is given to a human being who is there, who is leading that church, and instructions are given as to, hey, this is what you're doing wrong, and this is how you need to change, and this is what you need to do. All right, continue on with verse 1, Warren.
These are the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand and walks among the 7 golden lampstands. I know your deeds.
All right, Paul, before we go on, all right, take special note of in our matrix up here. The first line is the name of the church itself. The second line is the characteristic of the sender of the message. Now, the sender of the message could have used the entirety of the description that I read early on, right? All of the splendor of Christ, but he doesn't. He doesn't give a description of all the splendor of Christ. What does he do? He gives just a few characteristics. And what does he say here? He says, this message is from who? The one who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, the one who walks among his 7 golden lampstands. Now, why does Christ himself, who's writing this message, why does he describe only those characteristics of himself in the introduction of this message? Why doesn't he go on to describe his other attributes? What do you think? And why does he use just these 2 descriptions in particular in this message? Anybody have an idea? I'm asked this question with regard to all these, so let me give you what I think is the answer to begin with. I think the characteristic of himself that he uses here, that Jesus himself uses here, has to do with a problem that's within the church. So when Jesus describes himself, this message is coming from who? The one who holds the 7 stars in his right hand. So Jesus himself holds what? He holds the 7 messengers in his right hand. So he's saying, make no mistake about it, I'm the one who is in control of you, pastor, and all the pastors of not just these 7 churches, but all the churches of all time. See what he's saying there? And then he says, I'm the one who walks among the 7 golden lampstands. And who are the 7 golden lampstands?
The churches.
The 7 churches. So Jesus is saying, not only do I hold all the pastors of all time in my hand, but I'm walking among them. Just these 7 churches? No, all churches of all time. Jesus is saying, the reason I'm writing to you is because I hold you in my hand and I'm continuing to walk among you. And he delivers that message in that context, the context of those 2 attributes about himself. And so what does he say? He starts off in verse 2 by saying, I know. And what does that mean?
I know your deeds.
You can't hide anything.
That's right.
Knows everything about you.
That's right. And in the Hebrew mindset, when it is said that I know, that doesn't just go to something that is mental. That means that I have experienced this. So when Jesus says, I know, as Brother Kenny says, Jesus said, you can't hide anything from me. I know it. He says, not only that, not only have I known, I have experienced what is going on in your church. And how can he say that he's experienced it?
He's been there.
He's been right there. He's been walking among them. That's right. So he's saying that I know it, I've seen it, I've walked among you, so I know exactly what's going on among you. So don't think you can hide anything from me, and don't think that as I write this message, I don't understand exactly what's going on within your church. All right, read on one.
That's what you want to happen in your church.
Well, sure you do, unless you're not doing things right.
Yeah, that's what I mean, that's what, as a Christian, that's what you want.
Oh, and you make an excellent point there. I mean, would we want anything other than a pastor who is held in the hand of Christ himself? I don't think so. And would we want to be a part of a church or call ourselves a church unless Christ himself is walking among us? I don't think so. So those as you said, Brother Kenny, those are 2 very important things. All right, read on.
I know your deeds, your hard work, and your perseverance. I know that you cannot tolerate wicked men, and that you have tested those who claim to be apostles, but are not, and have found them false. You have persevered and have endured hardships for my name, and have not grown weary.
All right, pause right there. So with this is sort of a positive admonition, or a positive acknowledgement. It says, I know your deeds and your toil and your perseverance, those are good things, and that you cannot endure evil men, and you put to the test those who call themselves apostles, and they are not, and you have found them to be false. What is this saying? What is the positive aspect that we glean from this statement? What can we make of this? If we're going to fill in our chart here, what is the positive thing that Jesus is saying about this church? I might suggest that he is saying you have sound doctrine, that you are biblically sound in what you're doing. And why do I say that? Well, he says you cannot endure evil men. You put them to the test, and so he's saying your test is right, because by putting them to the test, what have you done? You have found that they are not what they call themselves, but you have found that they are false. So this suggests that the positive admonition about this church is that they have sound doctrine that's based upon scriptural truth. And he says, and you have perseverance, and you have endured for my name's sake, and you have not grown weary. So those are all pretty good, you know. The pastor there must be patting himself on the shoulder at that point in time. But here it comes, verse 4.
Well, it would be the statements that you hear, I got, like the doctor or whatever, or person, I got some good news and I got some bad news.
Yeah.
Which do you want first?
Yeah, yeah. So we got the good news first here. But what's the bad news in verse 4?
Yet I hold this against you, and you have forsaken your first love. Remember the height from which you have fallen. Repent and do the things you did at first. If you do not repent, I will come to you and remove your lampstand and its place. But you have this in your favor. You hate the practices of
The Nicolaitans.
which I also hate.
Pause right there. So he says the good, and then he says the bad, and then he says, well, but there's one other thing that's good before I come to the end. Well, let's talk about the other good things. Yet this you have, that you hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans. Anybody look that up? Anybody have an idea of what that's referring to?
My footnote says it's, I can't even say the word,
Heretics, they're heretic. Heretics.
Heretical.
Heretical?
Heretical
Heretical.
sect within the
Coming
church
out.
that has worked out a compromise with the pagan society.
Yeah, I read a couple of things about what that was thought to be. There was a member of the early church by the name of Nicholas, and there's some who say that he engaged in an apostasy and led a lot of people astray. There's not much historical background on that. Others say, and I tend to favor this interpretation, that the word Nicolaitan, if you dissect it for what the word really means, Nico means a conqueror, and the Laitans is a root word of what we would say is the laity in the church. So that a Nicolaitan is one who would conquer the laity. And that is to say that the Nicolaitans are those who favored a church hierarchy, such that you had some who were higher than others and some who were lower than others. And we have an example of that in 3 John verse 9, if we just look back a little bit. 3 John 9, and John writes this, I wrote something to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to be first among them, does not accept what we say. And it is said that this guy, Diotrephes, would be an example of a Nicolaitan or the Nicolaitan philosophy or heresy. That is, Diotrephes, who loves to be first among them, does not do what we say. So one explanation of what a Nicolaitan is somebody who likes to lord it over everybody else. Somebody who comes into a church and rather than accepting the church for what it should be, that is a hierarchy whose leader and head is Jesus Christ himself, he wants to substitute himself and say, no, I'm the head of this church, I'm the leader of this church, and it's my way or the highway. And so one of the commendations to the church at Ephesus, Jesus says, yes, this you do have, that you hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. So he's saying Jesus doesn't abide by that either. Yes, ma'am?
I have another footnote.
Mhm.
I have a footnote also. Mine says that the name Nicolaitans is held by some to be roughly the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew word for Balaamites.
We have a condemnation of Balaamites later on in one of the letters to the churches. So anyway, we don't know exactly what that is, but we know that Jesus is against it. Yes?
There's an additional part of the footnote of mine. It says, when we want to take part in an activity that we know is wrong, we may make excuses to justify our behavior, saying that it isn't as bad as it seems or that it won't hurt our faith. Christ has strong words for those who look for excuses to sin.
Okay. That could be another explanation of what this is. Again, there are certain things that we read